Continuing on with the American Revolution and moving into the war itself and the basic strategy and what went on. I'm not that concerned with who moved what men where, but just to get an idea of what went on and basically how we won this thing, because we are fighting 13 disunified, scattered colonies, the world's superpower, and yet we won. So we talked last time about advantages of both the British and the Americans. The British have the stuff. We have, as George Washington saw immediately, some real aces in the hole, and these are time and space. It is very difficult for Britain to conquer and hold such a big territory, 4 times the size of Britain. And the other thing George Washington sees from the beginning, and a number of people in Britain saw it too, is if you can just hold out, Britain is likely eventually to run out of money, to run out of patience, to run out of the willpower to keep continuing the war. So George Washington's strategy through the whole war is just don't lose. Don't lose your army, and you will continue the war until Britain finally gives up. Can he beat Britain in battle? Not really, but he can win the war another way. A couple more factors on the American side. We ended up with the militias, which were a mixed bag, some advantages and disadvantages. Again, the place, the terrain is a huge advantage for the Americans. We know the terrain, Britain doesn't. She's trying to move a large army. Now, she could move them by sea, but there's almost no roads in America, so very difficult to go overland. Particularly in the South, malaria. And when the British move into the South, they lose tens of thousands of troops to malaria and heat stroke. We estimate from British records that the British lost about 60,000 troops, either dying, not very few in battle, but mainly to malaria, disease, dysentery, camp fever, or desertion. Thousands deserted. In New York alone, well over 1,000. Another factor that's often overlooked, besides our ace in the hole, Ben Franklin in Paris and in London. It is Ben Franklin who gets us supplies from France. Another factor is British arrogance. The British assumed they would win easily. Wise heads in Britain knew otherwise, but they considered the Americans, and I'm quoting here, an exceedingly dirty and nasty people, all pimps and parasites. And they created a lot of enemies as they went along. They did burn, they looted, they occasionally murdered civilians. As one British officer said, he was appalled, "We have made people miserable by our presence." And they knew. Officers on the ground often knew, but of course nobody in London is listening to them. It is impossible to see this magnificent country and not get mad at the long train of idiotic mistakes by which we have lost it. George Washington's other ace in the hole, besides the arrogance and overconfidence of the British, is just plain luck. And he says God was on our side. I don't know which side God was on, but George Washington certainly believed it. He goes through the entire war again, 8 years of battle, not a scratch. Remember, we saw him in the Ohio Valley. 8 bullet holes through his clothes, 1 through his hat, not a scratch. 8 years of war. The man is untouched. He is never sick. He is never absent. He is constantly on duty. If George Washington had been killed, what would have happened to the Revolution? Would have been a much different war. But he is not. He had an aide who followed him around and carried messages, that kind of stuff, an aide de camp. And this one guy was injured with bullets 5 times, standing next to George Washington. He recovered each time. George Washington goes through the war and is untouched. So luck clearly had a factor. God or not, I'm not sure, but absolutely luck had a factor. So what is the basic war strategy? Britain cannot occupy all of America. At some point, she has to defeat our army in battle. So George Washington, who really preferred to fight aggressively, he preferred to have battle, knows that he's going to win the war by not losing it. Don't lose your army. I'm quoting Washington, "We should on all occasions avoid a general action or put ourselves at risk." and we ought never to be drawn into battle. So you can fight, but only when it's likely that you're going to win with good odds. So this is not the myth of George Washington that we learn. He is running away from battle rather than running towards it most of the time. On the other hand, he did know about guerrilla warfare from the Indians. He did know about British Army tactics because he had seen it in the Ohio Valley. The only way America could lose the war was to try and win it. That's George Washington again. So the British really have an uphill battle here. The factor of guerrilla war, why not use guerrilla war? Washington saw how effective it was in the Ohio Valley. He knew the tactics. He used them himself on occasion. He learned from the Indians. Again, guerrilla war, no rules, but refused to use them and did not let his officers use them except in very rare exceptions. Why? You have to win this war, not only in our own eyes, not only in British eyes, but in the eyes of Europe. Number one, how long does a guerrilla war go on? It could go on forever. When do you win a guerrilla war? Very difficult. Second factor is you have to have Europe recognize America and recognize that America has won the war. You will never do this with guerrilla warfare. It has to be a battle defeat to win the war, although Washington is extremely cautious about this. He does, on the other hand, use guerrilla warfare at certain times. So if you look at slide 46, talking about the strategy, the war moves from north to south is the general pattern. Remember the whole problem with Boston. This is the hotbed of resistance for a long time. But you have that great slide, number 47, of George Washington crossing the Delaware, which is highly romanticized. The painting is in Washington, D.C. It's huge. I've seen the thing. It's like 50 feet by 20 feet. It's an enormous painting. But this is one example of guerrilla warfare. Why is Washington crossing the Delaware? The important thing is which day he is crossing the Delaware. He is crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day. Why is this important? Because the rules of war in Europe is you don't fight on holidays, which seems ridiculous to us, but this is what was done. In winter, you don't fight in bad weather. You wait for spring to come around. You go into winter camp and you train, and you never fight on holidays. That's a day off. So Washington knows this. He is crossing the Delaware because there is about 1,000 Hessians in Trenton. And he attacks them, surprise attack, on the night of Christmas Day, because he knows, being Germans, how are they going to celebrate their holiday? They're going to drink as much beer as they can hold. That was accurate. Most of them were pretty stumbling drunk at the time. Surprise attack, and with very little casualties on either side, he captures 1,000 Hessians, German mercenaries, 1,000 POWs. But this is guerrilla warfare. He was not playing by the accepted rules of war that Europeans accepted. Francis Marion in the South, I will talk about in a minute, also guerrilla warfare. The fact that George Washington used spies, we don't hear about that too much. He had a whole squad of spies, particularly in New York and Pennsylvania, that he used. They didn't use guerrilla warfare often, but on occasion he did, and accepted it and actually promoted it. The British generally followed the rules of war, not always, particularly in the South, and on one occasion in Pennsylvania and another in New Jersey, the British bayoneted Americans, either running away from the battle or pleading for their lives and trying to surrender. So the rules of war in general, but there were exceptions on both sides. We did the same thing, by the way, in the South. War was fought by lining up and trying to annihilate the other guy. Wars were mainly infantry, foot soldiers with artillery, with cannon. So how well they were trained and how many men you had, that determined the winner of the battle. Muskets, which were generally used, rifles were there. They were more expensive. They were slower to load. They jammed more frequently. Muskets were more reliable, so that's what the British Army has. But they have a range at best of 300 feet. So you have to get close to the enemy, line up, and with mass firepower, try to annihilate him. And if you've seen the movie The Patriot, it highly romanticizes It's a story of Francis Marion, but the warfare scenes are very accurate in that movie. So, British strategy, slide 46. Number one, they have the biggest navy in the world. Immediately, you cut off New England. You try to cut off New England. Americans tried to invade Canada and cut off Montreal and Quebec. That did not work at all. Again, don't invade Canada in the winter. Not a good idea. Britain did bomb and occupy some American coastal cities, and Boston is completely cut off, remember, for close to a year. Why do they finally leave Boston? Remember, George Washington got those cannon that were dragged down from the Canadian border? Boston is surrounded by hills. And the British were in Boston, but the hills around Boston were not occupied by the British. Washington knows this. Once he gets cannon, he begins to plan to attack Boston. And maybe the most famous battle of the war, which I will talk a little bit about, is the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is misnamed because it was really Breed's Hill, but Bunker Hill was behind it. Whatever. The Battle of Bunker Hill is the key to defending Boston. Overnight, on a moonless night, the American army, such as it is, digs in, gets to the top of Bunker Hill, digs in, and throws up earthwork fortifications. They didn't build a genuine fort, but they build a defensive earthworks basically up there. The British look up the next morning and say, oh my God, look at that. There are something like 2,000 Americans camped up on top of Bunker Hill. And the British know if they get their cannon up there, they can bomb anything in Boston, including all the British positions. So the British immediately decide we're going to get them out of there. A few days later, 2,500 men are ferried across the river in Boston, the Charles River. They land at the foot of Bunker Hill, and being the British, how do they fight? They line up in nice rows with their bright red coats, and they march up the hill. The assumption was the Americans are going to run like rabbits, which has happened before. The Americans did not run like rabbits. The Americans, and I'm not sure if it's this battle or another one where don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, but they waited till the British were in very close range. Remember, the guns don't shoot that far. And they opened fire and annihilated the British. Every single officer was cut down, every single British officer. How do you tell the officers? They wore bright plumes in their hats, and they had different color ribbons on the sides of their outfits, so anybody could see who the officers were. They never learned, they never changed this all the way through the war. And roughly something like 500 or 600 British casualties. The British retreat under heavy fire. What do the British do? How do they fight? They line up again and go back up the same hill with the same result. Another 500 casualties for the British. They retreat, march up the hill again in the same lines. Okay, this time, slow learning curve here. This time, the Americans held, but they were out of ammunition by this time. The average soldier at Bunker Hill had 9 bullets. One of the huge problems with the American army is getting them supplies. We don't have powder, we don't have supplies. So when the British walked up the hill the third time, the Americans were pretty much out of ammunition. Most of them retreated, not all. Remember, these are farmers. These are largely untrained troops with no background. They had grabbed their rifle and shown up at Bunker Hill. These are, volunteers, essentially. Some of them stayed and fought to the death. Some of them had no bullets, and they used their rifles and muskets as clubs and fought until they were cut down by the British. The end of the day at Bunker Hill, there are 140 American dead, 300 wounded. British, 226 dead, and 900 wounded. The British lost roughly half of their troops. We lost a much smaller portion. So the British hold the field. Technically, they won the battle, but did they really win? As one British officer who survived said, A few more victories like this, and we will lose the war. Another British officer, very funny line. Americans' plan was to lose a battle every week until the British Army was reduced to nothing. It may be that our troops are not invincible, which they thought. They are certainly not immortal. And the importance of Bunker Hill, number one, is that it shows that the British are not invincible, that a bunch of untrained farmers can actually beat the British. George Washington said all the way through the war, those New England men, the best soldiers he had in the army. They rarely retreated. Okay, so the end result of that is that the Americans lost Bunker Hill, but there are other hills around Boston. They started lining up cannon on the hills, and the British very sensibly withdrew from Boston before George Washington could attack. Number one, the population in Boston is extremely hostile to anybody who's British, and there was nothing to gain. There's no riches in Boston, there's no great wealth, there's no resources, there's just a bunch of enemies. Ben Franklin, very witty, also talked about Bunker Hill. Britain, at the expense of $3 million, has killed 150 Yankees, which is about $20,000 a head, and gained a mile of ground. During this same time, the Battle of Bunker Hill, 60,000 children have been born in America. You can figure the time and expense to kill us all or conquer our whole territory. Ben Franklin and Washington know right away there is no way the British are going to win this war. They can't. We're expanding too rapidly. We're increasing in population too rapidly. Saratoga, also in New England, upstate New York, a small town in New York, is shortly after Bunker Hill, July of 77, I don't care about the date, and it becomes one of the key turning points in the war. Bunker Hill showed we have a chance. Saratoga really increased our odds. And what happened again, the British were coming down. They have a lot of troops in Canada. They were marching down their troops, several thousand of them, 5,000 veteran soldiers, plus the wagons and dependents and everybody else. And they're hoping to join up with the British in Boston and catch New England in between and squeeze them between the two arms of the British Army. If you can cut off New England, if you can subdue New England, the rest of the colonies will fall in line, they felt. Okay? Americans under Horatio Gates, again, I don't care so much about his name, largely militia, small group of American military, but largely volunteer militia Americans with some Indians on our side, using guerrilla tactics, basically ambushed the British troops marching through the dense woods in upstate New York. It was a running battle that lasted a number of days, but basically the British troops were cut to ribbons. Out of his 5,000 men, General Burgoyne lost close to 1,000. The American casualties were 150. So if you want to talk about holding the ground, the Americans held the ground and ended up walking away with much fewer casualties. Technically, that makes you a winner. Why is this an important battle? It's in the middle of the woods in upstate New York, because it made the Revolution a world war. This is the battle where France and later Spain and Holland decide, okay, America has a chance. She can actually win battles, and we can help her because we really don't like Britain anyway. So France begins to send money to pay our troops because we had none, particularly gunpowder, ammunition, supplies, later bayonets. At the end of the war, by 1780, there are 6,000 actual French troops that land in Rhode Island to help George Washington. So Britain has to stretch her military, which is large, to cover more areas, to defend Britain at home, because Britain is only 20 miles across the English Channel from France. She has to send a fleet with a lot of men to the Caribbean to protect her islands there, ships guarding Britain herself. Thank goodness, because instead of concentrating all her firepower on America, she had to spread it around, thanks to France and later Spain and Holland. So that's what's going on in New England, but the British abandoned New England. We can't deal with these Puritans, they're impossible, and besides, New England's not a very wealthy area, there's nothing much for us to gain here. They move to New York and create a headquarters in New York City. Remember, Britain has a huge navy. The American Navy, non-existent. There's nothing we can do to stop them. On the Hudson River, the British land 32,000 troops and 350 different warships with 10,000 sailors. America has less than 20,000 totally green, untested troops. New York had a large number of loyalists. Remember, New York depends on trade. So there were a lot of people in New York who didn't want war with England, who would like to continue business as usual, and a lot of family connections back in Britain. George Washington, basically, the myth of George Washington as a great general, this is one time he wasn't at all. He almost lost his army in New York on Manhattan Island. He was on one end, the British were on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, and they begin to sweep north. And George Washington's men were trapped on the north end of Manhattan Island, surrounded by water. He had no boats. How the hell did he get out of there? He put out the call, please get our men off. Please come if you have any kind of a boat. And a number of fishermen, American fishermen and small boatmen of all kinds, ran up to the northern end of the island and one by one ferried Washington's army across the river to the New Jersey side. At the end, a lot of them were American army were caught by as POWs. At the end, George Washington ends up with 3,000 men. Many of the men who ferried those American troops across were African American sailors and fishermen, by the way. George Washington is the last man to leave Manhattan Island. He made sure all of his troops left first. So the British stay in New York for about a year, and they move finally. Their final capital became Philadelphia. Again, why Philadelphia? Because it is full of Quakers, and Quakers don't fight. So they have no resistance in Philadelphia. And this is the part of the revolution which rightfully everybody learns about and remembers from elementary and junior high school, were the winters. Actually, Valley Forge was not the worst winter. The next winter in Morristown, nearby in Morristown, Pennsylvania, was an even worse winter. But remember, you fight in good weather, and then in the winter, you just go into winter camp and you train and you hang out until the weather gets good again. So the British are in Philadelphia with something like 32,000 troops. The Americans camp outside of Philadelphia. Valley Forge and Morristown are something like 30 miles from Philadelphia. So if the British move, they can try and block them. Horrific winters. Virginia does get quite a bit of snow. The winter of 79, when they were in Morristown, was the coldest on record until that point. Temperatures got to 10 below Fahrenheit. There were 28 blizzards over the winter, including a number that lasted from 1 to 3 days. The soldiers built huts. You have a couple of slides there of the winter. The soldiers built huts to live in, but green wood. The big problem, as I said, was getting food and supplies, not only for the men, but for the 1,000 of horses that they had in the military to haul wagons. By the end of the winter, most of those horses had been eaten, so food for horses was no longer a problem. The men go on half rations. By the time January comes along, they are on 1/8 rations. 11,000 men went into that winter camp, both at Valley Forge and Morristown, and close to 2,500 both winters died of hunger and cold and exposure. It got so bad that roughly 50 men a day were just walking off and deserting. I'm going home. I'm not going to stay here and starve and freeze to death. Why would I do this? We're not even fighting. 10 Pennsylvania regiments actually mutinied against the American Revolutionary Army and had to be subdued. George Washington finally, in desperation, sent men, he called it foraging. basically to loot anything in the countryside that they could find that was edible. They ate their horses, they ate their boots, they ate their saddlebags, they ate anything that they could find to fill their stomachs. And I'm quoting Washington here, this army must be reduced to starvation or dispersed. This is another officer. We were absolutely, literally starved. For 4 days, I ate only a little birch bark, which I gnawed off a stick. I saw several men roast their old shoes and eat them. This is a first-hand account. Some officers killed and ate a favorite little dog that belonged to one of them. There was nothing to eat. There were no supplies. They could not buy any because they don't have gold and silver. No shoes, sometimes no blankets, no clothes, no winter coats. George Washington writes constantly to Congress. This is from one of his letters. We have no less than 3,000 men now in camp, unfit for duty because they have bare feet and are otherwise naked. This was not an exaggeration. And you may have read this in junior high, but it was true that they could follow the American army in the winters by the bloody footprints in the snow because half the men had no boots or shoes. So these are pretty, it's amazing anybody stayed. The reason they did stay is George Washington, the officers stayed in camp. They did not go home. They stayed in camp, and George Washington spent the winter walking from hut to hut, begging the men to stay and to re-enlist. If George Washington had abandoned the cause, the army probably most likely would have disintegrated. But he goes man to man, hut to hut, and begs them to re-enlist. And enough of them do. Okay, let me stop there and talk about the three, what I think are even more important figures in the war than George Washington, although George Washington is the linchpin. Take care, have a good day.